moved to Canada to do a master's there. And then worked at a law firm there for about 6 or 7 years before moving to a company for about 8 years, and then moving back to India at IBM now, which is where I work. So what I thought would be helpful is just to give a little bit of background on the kind of work that I do, especially now at IBM, and how that relates to cybersecurity and why all of that is still relevant. So over the course of my career, I've worked on various kinds of different issues, trade law, competition law, contracts, obviously, because this is all in a corporate setting. But especially at IBM, as a company that's involved in IT services, obviously cybersecurity and security generally, right? IT security is an important component of what the company does on a day-to-day basis. It's an important component of what some of you had mentioned. You are CISOs, security officers, or information security officers. So obviously that is an important component of what every large IT services company is concerned about. But it's not just large companies like IBM, right? It's every company increasingly has to have a presence online one way or the other. And whether it's selling services or whether it's selling goods. I mean, selling goods is what we easily relate to, but increasingly the Indian economy is about services. It's about creating services, providing services, transferring services. And a lot of all of these services are online. That's, as we all know, India is a huge hub for IT services and creating IT services for the world. The papers are increasingly full of global capacity centers, these GCCs as they call them, which are really back offices, but not the back offices of 10 or 15 years ago for large companies where all of the back-end work alone is being shifted. Increasingly, Indian companies that provide these GCC capabilities and foreign companies who are setting up, or MNCs that are setting up their global capability centers in India, are doing cutting-edge research, right? They're creating software programs here for deployment across the world. They're doing research here to create new products and services that can be rolled out across the world. And the reason they can be rolled out across the world is, again, these are software. These are software that can be plugged into apps. These are software that can be plugged into larger products that can all be disseminated through the internet, or that can be used in products that can really be consumed around the world because they can be hosted on a cloud, for example, right? So all to say that it's not, and that's all on the enterprise side of things, right? And then obviously on the commercial, day-to-day side of things, we've all seen the explosion of apps that we use, whether it's obviously Facebook and TikTok and all of those. TikTok obviously not being available here, but other apps that we know track where we are every day. Google Maps. Without using Google Maps, it's almost impossible nowadays to think about how you would drive around, except in the immediate neighborhood. Or when we are using Uber, right? So all of those apps we know collect a lot of our data, right? So that's increasingly the government, the Indian government also recognizes that the use of all of these services by Indians on Indian residents on the one hand is a huge pool. Obviously we have the world's largest population now, right? Which means there's a lot of data about all of those people that lies in India, right? Data is the new gold. And that's true because all of that data is being harvested. All of that data is being harvested by, as of now, companies for their own benefit. We know, using AI increasingly, companies like Meta, Facebook, or Amazon, or YouTube, or Netflix, they all monitor how we are using that product. How are we using a Netflix app? What are we watching? And then we get recommendations based on what what Netflix thinks we might be interested in. Same thing on YouTube, same thing on Meta. So obviously all of that data is already being used, right? The government recognizes that data is something that people have, and that there is interest in being able to use this data. So again, this is all on the consumer side of things. But obviously with all of that data also comes other possible uses as to, that's for social good, right? So whether you're using that data of this vast population to improve the quality of life of people, how can you do that? You can do that if you were able to harvest all of that data to understand what, again, one example, what are the health priorities of the country, right? If you had, and Professor Dasarathi talked about medical records, right? If you really had medical records, then, and if the government had access to these medical records, the government could probably roll out schemes, right? There are various health schemes already in place, but the government could then also understand at a minute level, at a person level, where these trends of health are. Is there an epidemic somewhere? We all went through COVID, right? And the use of data to identify, we use COVID apps, right? All of that is the use of data to identify where every person is, each individual is. So that was a great example of how data could be used for general welfare and to avoid or to mitigate, at least to some extent, the harms that an epidemic, for example, could cause. Other uses could be in the field of education, right? If there was data and increasingly collected data, then, for example, on what all courses are being taught, where, what are those courses, what the students that are taking those courses, they are graduating from those courses and going where, right? If they take one course, what other course do they tend to take? There are all kinds of uses of data that a university could do, right? And I know some of you here at your own universities or colleges might be looking at how to use data to improve course curriculum and so on. So the potential of use of data is immense. But what that on the flip side means also that the potential of misuse is equally immense, right? And that's why we need regulation, right? If it's a pure free-for-all, then data could be used or abused and misused in any manner. And we've seen examples of misuse or abuse of data, especially over the internet, over the years. I mean, some of you may have heard of or come across people who have fallen victims of crime through phishing, right? Crime through online scams, right? And increasingly that is used towards to extract not just information but financially harm people who are not necessarily as savvy, whether financially or technically, and take advantage of those people, right? So that's why it's important to have some regulation around how data is used, what data is used for, and what are the consequences of abusing all of that data. So before we go into a lot more detail of that, which we will over the next few days, I thought it would be useful to start with just a brief overview of the Indian judicial system. I know most of you are not lawyers, one of you is, but most folks are not. So we'll just do a quick overview, and if it's too basic, let me know. But if you have questions at any time, please do feel free to just interrupt, and we'll take it from there. So before going into sort of the hierarchy of the courts, I'll step back, sorry. So before going into the hierarchy of courts, I'll give you a basic overview of what the different types of legal systems are, right? There are typically 5 kinds of legal systems. One is called the common law legal system, the other is the civil law legal system, and then there are legal systems based on religion, so religious systems, legal systems based on customary law or customs, and finally sort of a hybrid. India follows a common law system. What does this mean? In a common law system, well, actually India follows more of a hybrid system, but with emphasis on the common law system. But that flows from obviously our own historical tradition of laws, but also obviously what the British left behind for us. And what a common law legal system really depends on is laws as created by Parliament, but also laws as created and interpreted by judges and court cases, right? When we all understand what laws in the form of a legislation is. Whatever is written in a law, in a legislation, you're required to follow that. That is one part of law. But the other part is how a judge in a court interprets those laws. And that's why, as we all know, in India, courts have a significant, in our parliamentary system and in our system of democracy and governance, courts play a very important role, especially the Supreme Court, right? Part of the reason is because we follow a common law system. When the Supreme Court decides a case, not only is it deciding that particular fact situation in front of it, but it's also laying down law every time it creates a judgment. And we'll talk about some Supreme Court cases and some other cases as we go along. But that is therefore a manner in which law is created, court cases. Right? It's not just a decision between the two parties, but it also applies when the Supreme Court says something, that becomes law for the rest of the country. When the state's High Court says something in a particular case, what it has said in the context of that case also becomes law for the rest of the state, and so on. Right? So that's part of that's called judicial precedent. So when a court decides a matter, then further cases can rely on that judgment to say, well, the Supreme Court or the High Court in this case said so and so, and therefore that is now law. So this forms part of common law. The civil law system, which India doesn't follow, but countries such as France and some other countries, China, follow, is they create laws that are written down in very elaborate codes. So these run into thousands of pages and they try to be exhaustive. They try and cover every aspect. So if you take a civil code, the civil code covers different parts of civil life, whether it's contracts, whether it's marriage, and it's a very detailed code that tries to identify every aspect that may come up in life and address that. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. So the civil legal system that say France and China uses relies on civil codes or codes that are very detailed for every aspect. In that system, when there is a dispute, then the individuals who end up in court, and when a court decides that dispute, the court's decision only applies to that particular dispute. The court's decision does not create law. It only decides that particular dispute and that's done. The law is only what is written down. Okay? Just touching on a few other kinds of legal systems. We talked about, I mentioned that there is something called the religious system, right? Law that follows religious systems. And the primary example of that is in Saudi Arabia. They follow and create their laws as based on their religious system, right? And there are very few countries that follow a purely religious system, Saudi Arabia being one of them. The other legal system is based on customary law. and customary law simply means what people follow as custom. Right? Again, very few countries that follow only customary law, but even if you think about it in India, if you go down to the panchayat level, people do still use customary law. And in fact, our laws, our constitution recognizes the fact that there may be law making and decision making at that level. So that is also part of, and that is the reason why I said India follows a hybrid system, mostly common law, but also a hybrid system as you go lower and lower down into the community. Right? Okay. So that's just a broad overview of legal systems. And maybe what we'll talk about a little bit is courts. We won't go into a lot of detail, but as we all know, the Supreme Court sitting in Delhi is sort of the top court of the country. Decisions by the Supreme Court create law for the land in addition to obviously legislation that is created by Parliament. The kinds of cases that go to the Supreme Court are of course appeals that make their way all the way to the Supreme Court, but also typically Supreme Court takes up cases that relate to the Constitution and constitutional interpretation, because that is relevant to everybody in the country. You go down one level, there are high courts in all of the states, and as you see on parallel on the side, we have a whole bunch of tribunals, special courts, and consumer courts. So tribunals, you may have come across telecom tribunals, right? There are multiple tribunals in different sectors that are specialized courts. And obviously the objective of having those tribunals is that they are very specialized for that subject matter, which frees up all of the other courts for regular matters. There are tax tribunals, there are telecom tribunals as we mentioned, and so on, right? Same thing with special purpose courts. There may be special purpose courts created for specific matters that hear only cases of a certain kind, and that's again to be able to fast track decision making, because we all know that in India the judicial system is very slow. The judicial system is very slow because all of these courts are all clogged up with cases, and the biggest litigant in India is the government. The government has the maximum number of cases on the go at any point in time. There are efforts to try and reduce that. There are directives from the government itself saying, let's not file cases, let's not fight cases that we don't have to fight. And if that is really brought into action, that will free up the courts a lot. But that's still quite some time away. Again, we won't go into all of the details of all of these courts, but all to say that obviously we have a very vast system of courts through which cases make their way through. And why is all this relevant? Because we'll now talk about something else that's relevant to cybersecurity and cyber law, which is jurisdiction. Okay, jurisdiction. So what does jurisdiction mean? Any guesses? What might it mean when we say jurisdiction? Without trying to read all the slides and all of that. Limit of authority. Yeah. Yes. So it's right. You can look at it as a limit of your authority, and you can also look at it as this is where my authority spreads to. Right. It's also delimiting who can take up what case. So this jurisdiction really means what is the authority that a court has to hear a particular dispute or a particular matter. Typically it's split into three: subject matter, territorial, and pecuniary, or pecuniary meaning related to money. And why do we need to have jurisdiction? Any guesses why, when we think about a court having jurisdiction, meaning a court can hear certain kinds of cases? And we saw the complexity of courts on the previous slide, right? But why do we need to define what a court's jurisdiction is? Any thoughts on why we might want to have this idea of trying to define what a court can hear?
So that a litigant party can know where to file a case, and whenever we are giving power to any authority, there is a need to also limit the jurisdiction of that authority.
Yes, but why limit it? Why can't I just, walk into any court, pay the fee and say, I'm filing a case here?
Because of the nature of the country, it is very versatile and specialties are different. Communities have their own practices. And so we think there is no one single authority who's only knowledge and only capable.
Yeah, that could be one reason. I mean, effectively, it is to simplify matters, right? If you had think of an example. You bought something you walked into a showroom here, and you bought a shirt, right? And you find after you come home, you bought the shirt. It looked very nice when you were there. You brought it back home, and you realize there's a tear at the back, right? You could say, yeah, I want to file my suit anywhere. Tomorrow I am going to Bangalore, I will file my suit in Bangalore. But that's neither helpful to you nor helpful to the defendant, right? Unless you perhaps live in Bangalore or something, and so that's more convenient. But let's, similar example, take something else. You order something to be delivered to you, and this is now going to the cyberspace issue, right? You order something online to be delivered to you on Amazon. We've all done that. It's simple. Clicks a few buttons. You ordered a suitcase on Amazon. The suitcase shows up without one wheel. And Amazon surprisingly says no refund. This was one of those, you didn't look at those little things at the bottom, returnable, refundable, exchangeable. You didn't think about all of that. Your suitcase, it has to have 4 wheels, that's obvious, right? But it shows up without a wheel. Where do you file suit? Amazon doesn't have an office in Tiruchi. Where do you think you can go to file a case? Anywhere? Do you have to go to Delhi? Amazon's office is in Delhi. Do you have to go to Delhi now and find courts in Delhi? Right? So this is what jurisdiction is about. Where can I file a case? Anywhere? Why not anywhere? If I live here, I want to file a case here. This is most convenient for me. But it's very inconvenient for Amazon, because Amazon doesn't have an office here, they don't have lawyers here, they don't have a way to take your suitcase back here, right? So it's more convenient for them for it to be heard in Delhi. So why shouldn't the jurisdiction be only Delhi? So really that's what we're talking about. If anyone could file a case about anything, anywhere, that would just lead to chaos, right? Let's say there's a robbery in my house in Bangalore, but I was traveling here in Trichy. Can I go to the police station here in Trichy and say, sir, anga thiridu pechu sir, inga edha pandringla? Doesn't help, right? This guy, policeman here is going to say, what can I do? Go talk to your Bangalore police case, right? So that's what jurisdiction is about. It's about, at the end of the day, convenience and providing some order. Otherwise, it's not, the rule of law is not going to be effective. So, subject matter jurisdiction is really what kind of matters can a court hear? What kind of subject matters? And we talked about specialized courts, for example, right? So, in a specialized court for telecom matters, you cannot go and file a case that relates to a contractual dispute on suitcases, right? Consumer claim. In the consumer court, you cannot go file a claim that relates to a banking issue, because that's not what they're there for. So that is what is subject matter jurisdiction, right? And that subject matter jurisdiction is also important just to be able to compartmentalize and to try and expedite matters. Also means that the judges or decision makers in those specific subject matter jurisdictions are supposed to be experts. So if you go to the tax court, obviously, the judges are expected to be experts in tax law. Obviously, if you go to the Supreme Court or you go to the High Court, if you end up there, the judges there typically are supposed to have a broad knowledge across the board. But even within that, there are some judges who try and specialize. So often there will be judges who are used to hearing cases of a particular kind more than other judges. right? So that's subject matter jurisdiction. Territorial jurisdiction is exactly what we just talked about, our territory, right? We have, as we saw in the previous slide, we have district courts, municipal courts, and we have all of that because, again, the district court is supposed to hear cases only from that district. So the court's jurisdiction really tracks to some extent how the political boundaries are set up in the country. So that it's part of governance, it's part of rule of law, and it's more expeditious to have courts in those particular areas so that citizens or residents of that area know where they can go and where they can file a case and where their case can be heard. We'll come back to territorial jurisdiction because just as in the example we talked about, how does territorial jurisdiction work in a cyberspace context or in the internet context where you may be sitting in one place but the person or company that's providing you services or sending you goods is not there at all. It's pretty straightforward and simple when talking about territorial jurisdiction when both parties are in the same jurisdiction. Easy, right? Obviously, the court in that territory has jurisdiction over your dispute. But what happens when they are in completely different jurisdictions? What happens when they are not even in India? One of the service providers is not in India. Where can I file a case? Can I file a case at all? Right? What about the territorial jurisdiction of the Supreme Court? Supreme Court has territorial jurisdiction over the entire territory of India. So does that mean if it's an online service provider sitting in Delhi and I'm sitting here, do I have to go to the Supreme Court in the first instance? We look at that. Similarly, what if it is a service provider, Spotify, for example. Spotify doesn't, let's say they don't have offices in India, I don't know if they do, but let's say they don't have offices in India at all. But they're a platform provider, they provide an app, you can download the app is available in India, but they have no offices here. Does that mean they have no obligations at all? Because courts cannot pass any decisions against them. We'll look at that. That's what territorial jurisdiction is about. And finally, pecuniary jurisdiction, or as it relates to money. Again, the reason we have this is for the sake of convenience. If your case involves a fairly low amount, and how do you decide the amount? You decide as someone who's filing a civil case, you can decide whether you want to have a claim for whatever amount, right? In the case of a suitcase, let's say you bought the suitcase for 5,000 rupees, the wheel is broken. It would be a little illogical for me to say I suffered damages of 20 lakhs, right? The court is going to say that is how, right? And it's going to be hard for you to demonstrate how by receiving by paying 5,000 for a suitcase that came without a wheel, you suffered damages of 20 lakhs, right? So most likely it's going to be, okay, value of the suitcase itself, plus maybe something else that you are able to demonstrate. Oh, I was supposed to take that suitcase and go on a trip, I couldn't, so I had to rush out and buy, as an emergency, I had to buy another suitcase, that was 7,000. So not only am I not able to use this suitcase for 5,000, I also had to spend another 7,000, right? So maybe that's your claim. And based on the value of your claim and the nature of the kind of your claim, so here this would be a consumer action. I am a consumer, I received goods that were defective, so you go to consumer court. And within consumer court, there are different levels. If your claim is for less than some amount, say 20 lakhs, then you go to a particular consumer court. If it's above that, you go to the next level of consumer court. The idea being, the bigger the amount involved, the higher you can start your claim at. The higher court you can start your claim at. Right? So similarly, there are a jurisdiction that is based on what is the value of your claim. Okay. So, where is all of this stuff laid out? All of this stuff is laid out in what's called the Code of Civil Procedure, a lovely law from 1908, obviously given to us by the British. It has been amended, and obviously, as you probably know, a lot of our laws are still continuing from pre-independence era. Many of them are amended from time to time, but many of them have their roots from that time. But there are also, it's not as simple as saying there is one code, one document, and this is a pretty lengthy document as it is, a pretty lengthy law. But it's not that everything is in that one document. Again, every state has its own subset of rules for that state, right? And it's called the Code of Civil Procedure because it talks about what is this in civil cases as compared to criminal cases. In civil cases, what is the procedure for you to file a case? Where do you file a case? How do you file a case? So all of those nitty-gritty details that lawyers are supposed to know. When you go to a lawyer or call up a lawyer and say, I want to file a case, half his job or her job is to figure out where, when, how, what is the paperwork. All of that is set out in this Civil Procedure Code and other laws like that. Okay, so this is the clause that talks about territorial jurisdiction. It talks about, this clause relates to what's called immovable property, meaning land. You can't move land, so it's called immovable. And it says a lawsuit, is to be instituted where the subject matter is situated, meaning the subject matter, if the dispute is about land, and again, a lot of disputes in India, almost a majority of the disputes in India relate to land. Completely off topic, and that's why land reform and digitizing land records is so critical. Because a lot of dispute relates to, this is my piece of land, that is your piece of land, who owns this land, who owns that land, does your land overlap with my land, all of that sort of stuff, right? So hopefully at some point, if a significant chunk of all of that can be, the land ownership can be digitized, then that would reduce the number of cases in courts significantly. In any event, for land disputes, the court that has jurisdiction is the territory where the land itself exists. That makes common sense, right? But what about movable property? And movable is anything that cannot be attached to land. Anything that can be moved is movable, right? So goods and services. So that the rule is that it can be well, before we talk about what the rule is, why don't we maybe have some suggestions on goods, on things that, see, land is kind of obvious, right? If land is here, then the court that is in that district, in that neighborhood, that court has jurisdiction to hear any disputes about that land. But what about things that you buy? We talked about a couple of examples, right? A shopkeeper, and then we talked about Amazon. 2 examples, right? Where do you think, as a user, as someone who's bought something or availed of some services, where do you think, if I was displeased or if I thought there was an issue, where do you think I should be able to go and file a claim? Where all do you think I should be able to go file a claim? Anywhere in the country? Either buy, use, sure, wherever, place where you buy or use it. Okay, sure, place where you buy it or use it. Okay, that's interesting. So suppose I take the suitcase and I go to, I buy the suitcase in Bangalore, I come to Tiruchi, wheel breaks in Tiruchi. So I should be able to file a claim in Tiruchi, right? If it came broken in Bangalore, I should file a claim in Bangalore. If I brought it to Tiruchi and it broke here on the first trip, then I should be able to file a claim in Tiruchi. Okay, that's one option. Any other thoughts? Where it is produced. Okay, interesting. So, yeah, that's an option for sure. Increasingly, that would be China for the suitcase for sure, but we'll have to think about that. But yeah, that's an option. What other connection? Could it be the headquarters of the company that is selling me the thing, or wherever that company has an office? Could be that. Could it be where I paid for it? right? So, a lot of things we buy through distributors, for example, right? You want to buy a two-wheeler, TVS, we don't directly contract with TVS to buy a two-wheeler, right? We go to the dealer, the showroom. Showroom sells us the two-wheeler. So what about that kind of case? TVS has its headquarters in Chennai. It's produced in Hosur. It's bought in Trichy. I paid for it, but my bank account is in Bangalore. Right? So many possibilities, so many connections to every transaction. Right? So what the civil procedure says is a suit can be instituted where the defendant, meaning the person who's filing the claim, is the claimant. The other person who's defending the claim is the defendant. So where the defendant resides. So I could file a claim in Delhi if, and we'll come to a company, but if you are two individuals, a shopkeeper, if I go to a shop, I buy something, I came from Bangalore, I went to Trichy, I bought a shirt, then I can file a claim in Trichy because he resides here, the shopkeeper resides here, right? Or where the defendant carries on business, right? And the further explanations that talk about, in the case of a company, what does carry on business mean? Carry on business means not only where you have your principal office or headquarters, but also it doesn't have to be one headquarters, it could be multiple offices where you carry on business. Okay? Sorry about that. Okay, and then it goes on to say where the defendant works. So I could file a case where the defendant works. Okay. It could also be where the wrong is done to a person or movable property. So as you said, where I suffered, now you're looking at it not only where from the defendant's perspective, but now from the plaintiff's perspective, right? Where I suffered the harm. So it was delivered to me, the good was delivered to me in Bangalore, that's where I suffered the harm. So I can file a case in Bangalore. Because you're not only looking at the convenience of obviously the defendant, it can also be the convenience of the plaintiff. Okay, so that's all as it relates to civil cases. Now, the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Sanhita, that is the revised version of our criminal laws, right? One of our criminal laws. So if you think about it from a criminal perspective, where do you think I should be able to file a case? Let's say there was some criminal act that was done. Let's think about the simplest criminal act, a robbery or worse, a murder. Or fraud, right? Where do you think, as a victim of that harm, where do you think I should be able to file a case? Sorry? Yeah, makes logical sense, right? It's easy. It doesn't matter where that person is from, or it shouldn't matter where that person is from. I am the victim, so wherever I suffered the harm. So every offence should be tried by a court within whose local jurisdiction it was committed. So this is all easy stuff when it comes to, somebody murdering somebody else or fraud on you or whatever. But when you get to, again, cyberspace, and we've talked about, cyber crimes, phishing, someone sending emails, someone gathering up your data illegally and using it to hack into your accounts. And they are doing it from somewhere else and you are the victim, right? Where is jurisdiction? Where has the offence occurred? Did it occur where you were sitting? But it occurred onto your bank account. Your bank account itself is, yes, the bank has a branch in your city, but your account may be wherever, right? It's all stored on some computer system somewhere. So what does that mean? When someone hacks into your account and takes the money away, where is the crime committed? Or when your data is compromised and sold to some third party, your house address is sold, your mobile number is sold, right? And you find out about that, we all get 101 spam calls. But where has that crime occurred of misuse of data? So we'll look at all of that in one of the following lectures. Yeah. Those are section numbers. You're right. Section of the CPC in that case. Or 197 is a section of the BNSS. Okay. Just to make things a little interesting, we'll look at a few cases, court cases. Okay, there's a whole slew here, and we won't go into a lot of detail on all of these. But one of the early ones, as it relates to related to the internet, and all of these are Indian cases, was from 1999, and that related to cyber squatting. I assume, I mean, are you all familiar with what cyber squatting is? Anyone? Cyber squatting? No. Okay. So cyber squatting is using somebody else's domain name, right? We don't even think about domain names anymore, but when the internet first came along, domain names was an important aspect of your presence online, right? Google.com, right? We all know Google.com is where you go to run searches, and Google owns the domain name Google.com. Google also owns the domain name google.in, and so on and so forth, right? But what if, I mean, and we know a lot of companies start in one country and then move to other countries, right? What if when Google wanted to come to India, and there are recent examples of this, when Google wanted to come to India, what if I had registered the domain name google.in? Google.com was gone, Google took it. Google was a big business. I knew, I had the foresight that Google would someday come to India, so I registered google.in and just sat on it. And the day Google decides finally, okay, we want to come to India, and they try to get that name google.in, they don't get it because it's registered to me. And there are, I mean, you can go register a domain name in your name, right? Whatever domain name you want, as long as it's available, you can go have it registered to your name. That is cyber squatting. I have no connection with Google at all. Right? I just go, I see an opportunity there, and I register it. And there are recent examples of that happening even now. But that is happened in the case of Yahoo versus this Akash Arora. He registered the name Yahoo India. I don't know how many of us use Yahoo anymore at all. But before Google became as dominant as it is, Yahoo was a fairly big player in the search market, right? And in the email market and so on. So Akash had this smart idea of going and registering yahooindia.com. And Yahoo sued him, saying, you can't use that domain name because that relates to our business, Yahoo. That was one of the first cases where the Delhi High Court was faced with the issue of jurisdiction. Yahoo did not have an office in India. Yahoo was a foreign website, yahoo.com. You could access it from India, but Yahoo didn't have any physical presence here as a company. They didn't have an office. It was the internet, right? So that was one of the first questions where the court had to figure out, sure, this Akash person lives here. He has registered something, but the plaintiff, Yahoo, doesn't have any presence here, physical presence. So what do we do? And in that case, the court, that's one of the first cases where the court decided, yes, it doesn't matter that Yahoo is not present here or does not have a physical presence here in terms of an office. for example, but because this is the internet, it's visible to anyone here and it's accessible to anyone here. And so the court decided it has jurisdiction. It can take up a case even though one of the complainants, the complainant, doesn't have any presence here at all. Right? Interestingly, in that case, the court found that yahooindia.com was registered by Akash Arora before Yahoo came into India and therefore was legitimate. His registration stayed. Yahoo wasn't able to get that registration mark. They may have later settled and bought it from him or whatever, but at least as far as the court was concerned, they found that he had a legitimate claim to that name. But for our purposes, the important part is courts. That was one of the first cases where the courts decided, it doesn't matter that this person Yahoo has no presence here. The way they looked at it is, which is the right way to look at it, is the internet is visible and accessible to anyone wherever they are. Okay, another case, Rediff.com versus cyberspace. All of these names which don't even exist anymore, Rediff.com. Anyway, and this was an interesting case because it related to online defamation. They talked about Rediff.com had the issue here was as it relates to somebody making disparaging comments about somebody else, and that was hosted on Rediff.com, on one of the web pages that Rediff.com had. And the court in that case held that yes, Indian courts have jurisdiction over websites, not just those that are hosted in India, but websites that are hosted outside of India too. So this is the concept of extraterritorial effect. So we talked about, so just diverging from that or, for a minute, we talked about territorial jurisdiction. So jurisdiction in a territory, a physical boundary. Supreme Court has territorial jurisdiction over India. The district courts of Tiruchi have territorial jurisdiction over this district. But what is extraterritorial is laws or courts exercising jurisdiction, exercising power outside of their territory. And that's again increasingly relevant in the internet era or in cyberspace, because of things like websites that are hosted somewhere else. Obviously in India we have access to the internet, we can see anything hosted anywhere. And similarly, if you think about the cloud, right? Increasingly clouds, data is hosted on clouds, and the cloud server itself doesn't need to be here in India. The cloud server could be wherever, in any event, and in fact there are often multiple servers that are part of one cloud, right? So all of that data is outside of that jurisdiction, whether you take Tiruchi as a district or even India as a country as a jurisdiction, right? So back in 2001, the court said yes, even if the website is outside of India, because it is visible here, accessible here, we have jurisdiction if someone brings a court case here, right? Now that doesn't mean that if let's say there is a website that is hosted outside of India and it's accessible from here because it's on the internet, but somebody sitting in China wants to file a case, or somebody sitting in Bangladesh wants to file a case. It doesn't mean that they can suddenly come to India and file a case before a Delhi court, right? There has to be some connection. Yes, it's visible and accessible in India. That doesn't mean somebody who's a plaintiff outside of India can come and file a case here. They have to have some connection to being in India as well. So that is what was talked about in the NASSCOM case, the third one. There, the perpetrator of an online fraud scheme, right? Phishing, they sent an email, they extracted passwords and then siphoned off money. Those kinds of cases still happen. We all know Well, the latest thing that in terms of scams that's happening on mobile phones, if as some of you may have heard, is this concept of digital arrest. So we'll talk about that later. But these kinds of fraudulent online schemes and increasingly now mobile schemes still happen, right? So the person who was running that scheme was sitting outside of India, and NASSCOM, which is the National Software Association, right, in India, they filed a case against him, and the court applied what's called an effects test, which is jurisdiction based on the location of the victim. Where is the effect of that crime? If the effect of the crime is felt here in India, then, or wherever within that jurisdiction or within that district, then that court has jurisdiction over that case. It doesn't, and if you think about it, it's similar to what we talked about in the offline case, right? If wherever the crime is occurring, that's where you can file a case. It doesn't matter that the person who's committing the crime is even outside of India, not even in India. Okay. We will also talk about the other, sorry, it's a typo there, it's Shreya Singhal, I'm missing an A there, I'll fix that. Shreya Singhal versus Union of India, we'll talk about that case in a lot more detail because it's an important case as it relates to privacy. We'll talk about that in the next lecture on privacy. But as it relates to jurisdiction, there is an important distinction that the Supreme Court, this is a Supreme Court case, made there. It said, yes, the government has the power to block online content, right? We know that the Indian government from time to time has made rules and has passed orders to block certain content, saying that this content may incite violence or is not conducive to national security or for national security purposes. For example, regularly in Jammu and Kashmir, in India, the Indian government blocks access to the internet. Regularly, it asks content as it relates to subjects that could be considered sensitive to be taken down. Right? So, in this case, the court said, yes, internet censorship in certain cases can be allowed and is permissible, and there are a whole bunch of tests for that. We'll discuss that later. But it said, obviously, logically, that the government cannot try to stop someone outside of India from viewing that content, right? So, the courts have jurisdiction and the government has jurisdiction over what can be seen here. But if there is a website from, say, Pakistan talking about, talking about how Jammu and Kashmir belongs to Pakistan or whatever, that can be blocked and the government can order that to be blocked here. It cannot order some company outside to block that content from being viewed outside of India. Again, that's fairly logical. Okay, and then 2017 case, again relating to online defamation. There were defamatory videos on YouTube that were hosted outside of India. So the YouTube video itself was made outside of India. It related to Indian individuals who were residing in India, but obviously it was accessible in India. At that time, Google again, which owns YouTube, did not have a presence. But the court said that it doesn't matter, it's using the same sort of effects test or the tests in 2001, which basically said as long as it's accessible here and people can see it from here, then you can bring a case against a company which does not have a presence here. We are close to scheduled time. So I just wanted to stop here and check if there are any questions on this idea of jurisdiction. Again, we'll go into a little more detail on how this relates to privacy and how it relates to how laws are created as it relates to commerce over the internet. But I just wanted to use this lecture to give you a general sense of what jurisdiction means and why that is relevant for in the internet era. Any questions at this stage? Okay. we're also going to talk about later during the week about the use of AI, right? And again, all of that is intertwined with the fact that increasingly it's not relevant where some product or service is created, right? A lot of it is hosted on the cloud, a lot of development occurs in certain places but is used globally. So the idea of jurisdiction isn't going to vanish because people still need to know where do you file a case, and courts still need to figure out which kind of case can I hear and decide about. So the concept of jurisdiction is not going to vanish, but the concept of jurisdiction may need to keep getting modified based on developments in technology. And courts eventually get there. You don't necessarily need a new law for everything because basic principles generally remain the same, right? You don't necessarily need a new law to accommodate every change in technology. That's also not practical. But it means that courts have to be able to adapt when new issues and new technology come before the courts, adapt the existing laws even when there are gaps. And gaps meaning even when specific areas are not specifically laid out in the law, courts have to interpret it, read it in, and use basic principles. And that's exactly why, going back to the start of legal systems, that's exactly why common law is one of the best systems to adapt, right? Because common law allows judges to create law themselves. When they see a new case or a new issue, they are able to adapt it to the particular circumstances, and thereby they have created law at that time itself. Okay, so with that, yes.
Jurisdiction got to do anything with the citizenship of the claimant or defendant?
Good question. Typically not, because citizenship as a concept relates to certain rights that you have as a citizen of that country, right? Typically voting rights, right to a passport, right? But what is more relevant for jurisdiction is residence. So you could be a resident of somebody, of a place, but you not have to be, typically you don't have to be a citizen for most rights that you can think of. There are constitutional rights that are granted specifically to citizens, like the right to vote. But if I have a civil case or there's a criminal case, then typically it doesn't matter whether I'm a citizen or not. Typically matters whether I'm a resident or not. Having said that, we will talk later about things like the EU, the European Union GDPR, which is their law as it relates to data privacy. And there it becomes again relevant whether you're a resident or whether you're a citizen. So in that case, regardless of the way the EU GDPR works is, regardless of where you are a resident, if you are a European Union citizen, then you carry along certain rights with you even if you don't live in the European Union. So if a European Union citizen leaves the European Union and say lives in India, even then he or she has certain rights under the European laws, which then companies who are offering services to that European citizen have to comply with in India, because otherwise, similar to how Indian companies say, oh, we can exercise jurisdiction over companies that are not even in India, because the harm is to somebody who is sitting in India. The European courts say, well, we can exercise rights and we can exercise our power over Indian companies, even though neither the company is in India nor is an individual in India, but he is a European citizen. So by virtue of being a European citizen, he has certain rights that carry along with him or her throughout the world wherever they go. So it's a good question. So yes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So that's what we talked about. The jurisdiction is typically where the harm occurs, where the victims are. typically that's where the victim will go to their local police, right? Because that's the most convenient. Suppose there's an online cybercrime that somebody is sitting in Russia carries out on, say, people sitting in India, right? The victim in India will go to the local police. And this is where law enforcement becomes relevant. The law enforcement agencies then eventually have to work with the law enforcement agencies of the place where the perpetrator of the crime is sitting. Right? So, in just a couple of weeks ago, there was a news story of, I think, 15 or 20 people being arrested here in India because they were running online scams, online frauds on individuals sitting in the US. So they were posing as tech support people and calling these people up, having them go to there saying, oh, you may not be able to access your bank account unless you provide this, unless you install this particular software update. If you don't install the software update, you will not be able to access your bank account in 2 days' time. So let me walk you through step by step the process of how to upgrade your software. And what is that software really? It's a malware, right? It's not authorized by their bank or anything like that. It is a malware that they are installing onto that person's computer to then extract their banking passwords. So they convince that individual to go sit in front of their, and again they usually try and target older people who are not that tech savvy, and they try and figure out, and again there's data privacy involved even before they get to that stage. They figure out who are the individuals, what are their ages, so they target only above a particular age group, right? Often they find out, are they living alone? Easier to target somebody who's living alone. And then they call them, so they've got their phone number. Then they make calls which are not, obviously they are not, these individuals haven't asked for these calls, right? This is no consent. So then they track these individuals, target these individuals, call them, and then exactly the scheme was they would say tech support and make those individuals log on to their bank account and install the software which they would send to them by email or give them a link to go to. They would go to that link, download that software, log into the bank account at the same time. The software is then, as they are typing their password, reading the password. So now these individuals behind the scene have access to that bank account. And they were using that to siphon off money from those bank accounts. And those individuals are here based in India. So the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation in the US, worked with the Indian police to then have all of these people arrested here in India. So that's how it works from a law enforcement perspective. Right, so where they would be punished is a question of jurisdiction, and that would be here. Right, because it is still, and that's a great question, because do the laws here, they can only be punished if the laws in India say it is illegal for them to do something. So if it is illegal for them to have run this scam, even though the victims are not in India, then they will be punished here. The other option is that they can be punished in the US, but they would have, and the US courts can, obviously the harm was committed there and it's illegal there. So the US court can pass a judgment, let's say imprisoning them for 3 years. But the practical question is, well, they are sitting in India. So that's where the further step of what's called extradition comes into play. So these people have to then be extradited from India to the US and then put in prison there. Obviously, for large scale crimes, criminals who are playing in hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, they are pretty well aware of all these extradition treaties as well. There are treaties between countries that allow individuals to get extradited if the court in that country has passed a judgment against them. But not all countries have these treaties amongst each other. So a lot of individuals, and Vijay Mallya for example is one, court here has passed judgment against him, but he is sitting in the UK, and it has been impossible to get him out from there to here, right? So there are ways to do it, but then there are also ways to basically avoid it.
Can two judicial process happen simultaneously in two jurisdictions?
Yes, they can, but there is also the concept of double jeopardy, meaning you cannot be punished for the same offense twice, right? So if I have already been, passing a judgment is stage one, and then giving it effect and giving the punishment is stage two, right? So if there is a judgment passed against me here that says go to prison for 3 years, and I am sitting here, right? And at the same time, if there is a court case running in the US saying for the same cause of action, for the same crime, then I can argue in the US that no, I have already received punishment in India for that same crime. Now, the question is though, whether the principle of double jeopardy will be recognized by the US court or not, because they may very well say, I don't care, or the double jeopardy concept only applies to crimes that you've committed within my jurisdiction. So this is your first crime in my jurisdiction. First time you're getting punished for that crime in this jurisdiction. So I don't care if you've spent 3 years in jail in India, you have to spend 3 years jail here as well. Okay, any other questions?
What will be the cases relating to mutual funds cryptocurrency? Whether it will come under movable property?
Good question. So money or anything money related is typically considered movable, right? The only thing that's considered immovable is land and buildings, because once you build a building on land, then that is also immovable, it cannot be moved. But anything that relates to money is considered movable. So and crypto is the next level of movable, because again, the currency that, for example, that you can trade in India is not even created in India. It can be created, but obviously things like Bitcoin and Ethereum are not even created in India. They are created outside. There are exchanges here, right? But exactly these kinds of questions are going to increasingly come up. Suppose there is a hack in a cryptocurrency holder, and suppose you bought cryptocurrency and it's being held by a holder that is outside of India, and that gets hacked, and you've lost all your cryptocurrency. Where do you file a case? Where do you file a suit? Right? The harm is here, but even if a judgment is passed against some company, the company that has lost your cryptocurrency, how do you enforce it? Let's say the court says, okay, you can, they did not have adequate security procedures in place, and therefore they are liable to reimburse you for the value of your cryptocurrency, which is whatever, 10 lakhs. How do you enforce that? Typically in a normal case where the company against whom you have a judgment, if they are also based in India, how you would enforce that is you would then go to court and the court says, let me dial back once again to help explain the process of enforcement of decisions. When a court passes a judgment, in the case of a criminal case, it's fairly straightforward. If it's arresting somebody, the court will send out an order, the police will go arrest that person and bring them to jail. Okay, fairly straightforward. In a civil case, if you have damages, like in the Amazon case, the example that we were talking about, I lost 5,000 plus 7,000, right? The court says, yes, Amazon, you have to pay this person 12,000 rupees. And that judgment is passed against Amazon. Let's say Amazon doesn't pay, just ignores the order, right? Then technically what you can do is you can go back to court and say they ignored your order, and therefore I need you to go enforce it. And by that, what they can do is there will be assets of Amazon. Amazon has an office, Amazon has a warehouse, things like that, they can go, through the court process, you can go and have things in the Amazon warehouse that belongs to Amazon, for example, in the extreme example, you can have that confiscated by the police, and the police can actually have that sold and give you the money, right? So there's a way of, that's how you enforce judgments. You look for physical things that the defendant has, against whom you have a judgment. Can I go have the court then pass an order that that office building should be now attached, right? And then proceeds from that sold to satisfy my judgment. But what do you do in a case where the defendant is not in India at all? What do you enforce? How do you enforce? How do you enforce a judgment that says, yes, that cybersecurity, that crypto agency owes you 20 lakhs, but they don't have an office here? How do you enforce that judgment? You can't. So that is a practical limitation of having a judgment passed here. Perhaps you could wait for the time that they open an office here. That may never happen, right? So that, yes, that's a good example of, as a practical matter, how it's difficult, and why you may choose then to say, okay, I'm not therefore going to file case in India because it's going to be worthless. Even if I get a judgment, what do I do with it? And you may choose to file a case in the location where that company is. The other option is countries between them again have treaties where if a court decision in one country has been granted, you can take that court decision to the other country and say, the Indian courts have given me this judgment, I want you, foreign court, to enforce that judgment. That does happen. That is also a long process, but that is possible. That can be done. And there are treaties between countries to allow that to happen. Okay, I think unless there are any other questions, I think we are past our time. So, Janet? Okay, I think lunch outside. If you have anything you want to talk to me one-on-one, please feel free to come up and we can chat. Thank you.